Wisconsin Eye is at the Green Bay Public Library. We're interviewing candidates in the special election, Senate District 1. Representative Andre Jacque is in his fourth term in the State Assembly, representing the 2nd District. He's one of two candidates in the May 15th primary for the special election, Senate District 1. And Andre, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Great to be back, Steve.
A few days before the primary election, what do you consider the top issue in this race, sir?
You know, I think the top issue is really, well, we're sent down to Madison to address the entire spectrum of issues that come before the state. And so independence is really a key issue. And somebody who's going to stand up for the district, stand up for principles, but also be able to work across the aisle and be an independent voice for the district. And that's what I think I have been in the 2nd Assembly District. The 1st Senate District is really an opportunity to have a much greater ability to get things done for the people of Northeast Wisconsin, and I think that's really the key issue is independence.
Tell me about the 1st Senate District, since you have broadened your horizon now to go from 1/3 of it to all of it. Tell me especially about the Kewaunee. There's an issue with polluted wells in Kewaunee. Has progress been made, and what are some next steps?
Well, you know, it's certainly something that I think there are efforts underway. I was very supportive of legislation that passed as part of the budget to have a total maximum daily load TMDL study of the watersheds along the eastern shore of Wisconsin from Onapee all the way down to Sheboygan. And, you know, we do have a different kind of topography here in Northeast Wisconsin, that karst topography that probably plays a role in terms of how things filter through into the water. I mean, certainly having clean water is critical. And, you know, we have been looking at how can we encourage safe practices in terms of rotational grazing and making sure that we don't have overspreading of manure. Of course, there's the new DNR 151 guidelines that have come forward. Kind of a compromise that a lot of folks aren't necessarily satisfied on either side. Of course, we still have issues in the towns, and I work very closely with town governments when you deal with the implements of husbandry. But you know, it's something that I think that we're really, you know, starting to make some headway. Hopefully, looking at not only some of the digester options to deal with that excess manure that is getting into the water, but also when you talk about a TMDL, what that's going to do is to spotlight what those currently non-point sources of pollution are, so that we do have, you know, really the ability to control and mitigate where really 80% of the pollution comes into the watershed, as opposed to.
Has been made. It's not going to get worse before it gets better, do you think, Representative?
You know, I think that we're at a point now where I don't think it's going to get worse, but I do think that it is something that you know, we're going to have to make sure that we make it better by really focusing on what the solutions are to keep it from filtering into the water. Yeah.
Okay, Democrats are making a key issue the state's package of incentives to Foxconn. Do you think 1st District businesses are going to benefit from the Foxconn development in southeast Wisconsin, sir?
Oh, absolutely. I think that we still have, I mean, of course, with 41 and 43, both interstates which serve my assembly district, but also the 1st State Senate District, it's something that there absolutely is going to be a supply chain that is going to extend up into the Fox Valley. Of course, we have major, well, metal work that occurs here in Northeast Wisconsin, but also suppliers like Karen Net and Two Rivers that does industrial netting toured there. Of course, they're working along with many other businesses here in the New North to be part of that preferred vendor list. And I do think that that's going to happen. I do think that, you know, when we're introducing kind of a new industry to the state of Wisconsin, that along with that, there's going to be, you know, we've already seen a number of expansions in terms of employers here in Wisconsin that, you know, this is part of the environmental change. This is part of what makes people want to come to Wisconsin, because they do see that we are growing and growing in the right directions, and we need to, of course, make the workforce training investments to be able to get people here and keep them here. But that's something that I've always been very interested in. Of course, in the budget, started working on how do we address some of the reciprocity issues when we get to some of the skilled trades and giving people the opportunity to prove their skill sets here in Wisconsin.
You mentioned Highway 41 and 43, critical to the Senate District 1. But there's an impasse over, you've been a part of the dialogue, over how to pay for future highway current needs and maintenance and construction. How should we finally come up with a long-term funding solution, sir.
Sure. And certainly I think when we talk about transportation, we want to make sure that Northeast Wisconsin isn't getting short shrift. And I think everybody still understands that Milwaukee is very important to the state's economy, Southeast Wisconsin, but also the legislative leadership that tends to reside down there has made sure that there is emphasis on some of the mega projects that any single one of which spread statewide would provide quite a bit of additional resources at the local level, which is something that I've been very interested in and pushed towards moving to have additional resources at the local level. As we've increased transportation spending, it hasn't kept pace in terms of sending it to the local level. So very pleased that we're starting to go in that direction. I think when we look at the funding source, certainly we could direct funds from the general fund into the transportation fund and build it into the base on an ongoing basis. And certainly the governor has also described a framework whereby you could have an overall reduction in general taxes and an increase in taxes for the transportation fund, gas tax or registration fees. And that's something that I think makes some sense too. You could, right now, 6 months out of the year, you still are paying electric and other utility taxes. And realistically though, if you're moving it from the general fund into the transportation fund, it's going to be a budget issue, and it's all about priorities. That's what the budget is. I think one of the things that we were able to do with prevailing wage repeal, particularly for the local level, is when you're not dealing with the Davis-Bacon mandates that attach for most state highway projects because they're using federal dollars, although we did the funding swaps legislation now. But anything that uses federal dollars where you get a lot more road for your dollar when you're able to bid it at the local level. And that's certainly something where I've been a champion of local government. I actually just received the Friend of Towns Association Award again as one of their statewide legislative champions. And I really think that at the local level, we've been able to really do a good job of making sure that there is a lot of bang for your buck. And then there's also projects like the Southern Bridge in De Pere that are very important. That there was a little bit of a roadblock there previously in terms of not having a state senate champion for that project. I think we're getting very close. I think at the federal level, we're really at the point now where it's just getting the push to get it enumerated. But was able to have a roundtable with Secretary Ross from Wisconsin Department of Transportation, as well as many, many local elected officials throughout Northeast Wisconsin recently. And I think he's really made some good progress in terms of bringing projects in, under budget and in time. And I know that certainly Secretary Gottlieb did that as well. So.
The speaker he's fairly enthusiastic about tolling. Do you share his enthusiasm on tolling?
I think the reality on tolling is that it's not the quick fix that people might like to think that it is. It's not going to have a short-term impact. It's going to take a while before you would be able to realize any, there's a front investment that you would have to make, and there's certainly some ongoing costs for maintenance there. I have concerns about whether tolling is really a viable solution. I know that there are certainly studies that have been underway, but I certainly am listening to critics of tolling as well. So I think it probably is more realistic to look at some of the other options that I suggested.
Is the dark store controversy an issue in the 1st Senate District, sir?
Well, I think throughout the state there's discussion of dark store and assessment, and we certainly have assessment practices in Wisconsin that we're more or less talking about codifying. I think the issue has been, there also have been court cases that have been thrown out. There also is kind of a culture of litigation in terms of people settling as opposed to playing out the court process. I don't think anybody wants there to be non-comparable properties used as comparables. I just think people don't want there to be a system gamed on either end. I think Wisconsin's legislation that was put forward last session was modeled after Indiana's legislation, which of course they then went back and repealed. So I know that even the authors have suggested that they know that there is going to be an amendment needed to be able to move that legislation forward. And I know the initial bill, before it came forward, there were probably about 12 different versions based on what the author had told me in terms of what that language could look like. So hopefully we'll find a sweet spot. I'm very optimistic that the Legislative Council Study Committee on the topic is going to get us in the right place, and hopefully we'll be able to, have a very broad compromise that we can start out the session with.
School safety, gun laws. You were part of that debate in the Assembly. Do we need to make any changes in gun laws to keep our schools safer?
Well, I think the issue when people talk about the gun laws and Second Amendment and the tension that exists there is what would actually be solved by a proposed piece of legislation? What would it keep from occurring that otherwise has happened? And I think we've had issues with enforcement of gun laws, and certainly that's something that in the Assembly we addressed in terms of straw purchasers or human holsters, or making sure that there's sufficient penalties for those that have committed gun crimes. But we also see that many times the horrific tragedies that occur are something where, regardless of whatever weapon is used, and there have been multiple weapons used, is that person who is bent on causing harm going to be able to find a way to do it? And, in the case of, for instance, the Texas church shooter who should have been on a list where he wasn't going to be able to purchase a weapon, well, those domestic violence crimes weren't reported by the military. And so, there are countless examples where, we really need to make sure that our current laws are being enforced.
The Dems, of course, offered the background check amendment. I don't think you supported that.
I don't believe so. Certainly there's any number of procedural votes that might come up. I think the reality of the situation, again, is, a piece of paper on a wall is not going to make an area safe, just as, you want to make sure that people who are wanting to defend themselves and others have the opportunity to do so. It's the law-abiding people who are going to actually follow laws. People who are already intending to disregard them, passing a new law isn't necessarily going to keep that from happening. And I think we've seen that there are any number of loopholes. No matter how you kind of change the game, we have borders with several other states here. So
let's talk about funding schools. If you're a member of the Senate, what will be your priorities in terms of K-12, on choice, and the UW system, on those three school and higher ed issues, sir?
Sure. Well, I'm actually former student representative for the UW system to the Higher Education Aids Board. So keeping college affordable, and certainly I paid my own way through college, it's very important to me that we do make that accessible to folks. And I think that the UW system is doing some positive things in terms of being able to make sure that those with lower incomes are going to be able to have a UW system tuition that's affordable. What we've been able to do in the legislature in terms of being able to keep that tuition frozen, though, I think is something that, in reality, the UW system didn't make some of the hard choices that other areas of the public sector had to. Going back before Act 1 or Act 10, you had, really tuition as an escape valve. So I think that certainly I'd like to make sure that we keep controls on the cost of education. As far as K-12 and school choice, do we need to expand choice further? Well, I've always been a strong proponent of school choice. I actually was the author with Senator Olson of expanding the public school choice open enrollment legislation my first term in the legislature. So whether that's other public schools or charter schools or private schools, having those dollars follow the student, I think, is something very important. So, I guess what I would say with education, and this is something going back to my time at the UW in the Follett School, a graduate study with an instructor where we did focus on both adequacy and equity in education. And Wisconsin actually does very well by those measures. We're well above the adequacy level. And what my instructor and what really studies will tell you is that above that adequacy level, it's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it. And so, we have school districts with very similar demographics where one is able to outperform the other consistently or significantly. And I guess what I would say is there certainly are different challenges. I certainly like what the governor had initially proposed in terms of an additional tier of sparsity aid and trying to flatten it out. And I know that there are certainly other efforts underway to look at how do we fix the funding formula. Certainly, when you have a formula statewide where in some cases some interests have been somewhat protected by past legislative decisions. And that's the sort of thing that, just like shared revenue, when you have these large unwieldy state funding formulas, you need to look at how can we reconfigure things to be fairer and focus on things like special education, where there is certainly a higher cost per student, or some of the other categoricals. But sparsity aid is certainly something where I would have liked to have seen that extra tier put in place.
What about, let's circle back to the UW tuition freeze. Should it be continued into the next biennium?
Well, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. On your Facebook page, you're known to be a champion of, endorsed by the Right to Life community.
Sure.
You say this: much more work ahead needs to be done to protect future generations and sanctity and dignity of human life. If you're in the Senate, what are the next steps on this issue?
Sure. Well, and certainly I have been very proud to be a champion for the pro-life issue, and that's something that I've always put on my campaign literature. I think that regardless of where my constituents stand, they know where I stand and are pleased that I've staked out a position and stuck with it. So to the extent that you look at something like public subsidies for abortion providers, that's something that I've worked very consistently and had successes in terms of when we've seen waste, fraud, and abuse, removing those dollars, finding ways to screen taxpayer funds from being used for abortion. That's certainly something that I'm going to continue to look at. But I mean, beyond that, certainly there are other proposals that are out there. Of course, I've been part of the legislation in the past. It wasn't the author of it this session, but dealing with the trafficking or exploitation of aborted children's organs. But something very significant that I was the author of that I do think has very significant support and something that I think is very achievable is dealing with the arrangement between the University of Wisconsin and Planned Parenthood, where you have UW doctors who are state salaried, state benefited, receiving state malpractice insurance, and yet they are at an abortion-only facility in Madison for Planned Parenthood, where they are performing or training on abortions, where I think that that's something that if people really understood what was happening, they'd really start to scratch their head and ask some questions, because that's certainly not an arrangement that you've seen elsewhere. I mean, at one point you actually had the medical director for Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, who was a full-time UW employee. She just had half of her UW faculty contact hours purchased by Planned Parenthood, and that's an arrangement that I think clearly is not necessary, and look forward to bringing that back to my colleagues in the legislature if I get a chance to continue.
How would you summarize the differences between you and your opponent first in the primary, and then if you're the GOP nominee in the general, please?
Sure. Well, and that's an interesting question, just because I don't think a lot is known about either of my opponents. They really haven't staked out specific policy positions, and I know that might be somewhat by design. People have said that the extent to which I do have a known track record, a conservative track record, that could be picked at or used against me. I think, honestly, it's a strength that I've stood for something. I think it's a strength that it's demonstrated that I've been willing to stand up to my own party leadership or to lobbyists in Madison to be able to get things done. And I am very proud that I have been able to get things through the legislative process. So I think that stands out, that I have been a strong voice for my constituents. I've gotten a lot of loopholes closed and really gotten government to pass the common sense test more often, get government out of the way of doing the right thing. So I think that's certainly a contrast, is that I've obviously accepted offers for debates here locally. My primary opponent hasn't taken me up on those. I'm sure that there will be debates for the general election, and I look forward to those as well. It's kind of funny to be the graybeard in the race at age 37, that I have two younger opponents running against me, and also to be the longest residing in the district, at least in terms of adult life here. This is an area that I'm very proud to call home. I live in Pere with my wife and 5 kids, and very active in the community. I think that's certainly something that shines through, is when you look at my emphasis on public safety, closing the loophole on child enticement, addressing human trafficking, drunk driving, domestic violence and abuse. The list goes on and on, closing the hit and run loophole. But I'm very proud to have the support of the 5 Republican sheriffs within the 1st State Senate District, and 3 district attorneys as well. But these are folks that I've worked very closely with on things like how do we address victims' rights, and certainly there are some concrete ways that we need to advance on those in the upcoming legislative session, some legislation that I put forward at the end of this session with the help of the Crime Victim and Witness Professionals Association. And so, I mean, I guess you know, some people will try to, I mean, there's already a particular lobbyist or lobbying group that are trying to characterize me as a career politician for being in office 7 years.
Yes, that's the term on your primary opponent's Facebook page. He's running because we have too many, quote, career politician. His term, not mine. So I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
You know, it's kind of funny because, of course, the lobbyist who's kind of orchestrating my opponent's campaign.
Who is that? Do you want to identify them?
John Gard. His main contract is with the operating engineers, the road builders union.
Okay.
And you know, my opponent's campaign manager was hired by John Gard's lobbying group, Gard Business Group, at the end of last year. And whether he still works for John Gard now or whether that has changed as a result of him being the campaign manager for my opponent, but the reality is John Gard is accompanying my opponent around to really most of his appearances here in the district. And in addition to that, there's this group, Midwest Growth PAC, that has, of course, been associated with John Gard in the past, but it has John Gard's former campaign treasurer and John Gard's former campaign manager, who is its director. And I think people can connect the dots. It's very clear that I ruffled some feathers and stepped on some toes on, you know, not just the pro-life issue, but certainly prevailing wage repeal, or at least insisting that there be significant reform, which we accomplished in the budget a couple sessions ago. And I'm very proud of the cost savings that have resulted. That's something where stood up for my principles, even if it caused some heartburn with leadership. It's something where, you know, obviously I think my colleagues were in the same place on. And so, you know, that's where, again, I'm very proud to be independent of the Madison crowd. And so, you know, to the extent that this lobbyist who spent 20 years in office, and, you know, now my opponent is also supported by the co-chair of the Finance Committee and the Assembly Majority Leader, and yet I'm the career politician when, you know, I was elected, at, you know, first running for partisan office at age 30, and my opponent wants to get into office at age 24. I don't quite understand why I'm the career politician. I think that's certainly a term that my wife would balk at, because she's never going to let me become that, and I don't want to. I just want to make as big of an impact as I can in the time that I have, which is why I want to go to the state Senate. It's the same salary between the Assembly and the Senate.
It is.
And realistically, I probably am not going to be in a position to look at anything further beyond that. But there are good bills that die in the Senate, just as I had 4 bills with very broad bipartisan support at every step in the process that died in the state Senate at the end of this session.
Okay.
I'd like to think that if I'm in the state Senate, not only do those bills get done, but a few others that get held up in committee as well. And it's just it's an opportunity to advocate for a few more district interests that I think maybe have not gotten the attention that they've deserved. And so you know, I'm very pleased with the work that I've done, because the only limitation to what I can accomplish is you know, the amount of time that I'm willing to put in. And I think certainly whether they like it or not, my colleagues will give me credit for being persistent in working through the legislative process, which is why I've been able to get so much done. And really, the credit for that goes to my constituents who give me the bill ideas and concrete examples of where government just isn't making sense.
Okay, understand. Representative Andre Jacque is one of 2 Republican candidates in the May 15th primary in the 1st Senate District. Representative, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.